The first Barsoom story appeared in the Pulp magazine All Story as Under the Moons of Mars. It was later published in book form as A Princess of Mars in 1917. So when you pick up A Princess of Mars today, you're opening a book that's more than a century old. And yet Barsoom doesn't feel like a museum piece. It feels like somewhere. That's the thing that has always fascinated me about these books. Burroughs wasn't simply saying, here's Mars, and here's a monster, and here's a hero to fight it. He created a world with its own peoples, histories, politics, customs, and geography, and then dropped a bloke from Earth in the middle of it and let him get on with the adventure. The science is often gloriously wrong. Some of the attitudes are very much of their time, and the Mars that Burroughs imagined bears very little resemblance to the cold, barren planet we've actually photographed. But none of that really matters, because once John Carter arrives on Barsoom, you believe in it. And I think that's where we should begin. Not with Edgar Rice Burroughs, not even with John Carter, with the strange world itself. Edgar Rice Burroughs wasn't a writer who had spent his childhood dreaming of becoming a novelist. By the time he started writing, he'd already tried rather a lot of other things. He had served briefly in the army, worked as a railroad policeman, tried mining, worked in business, and eventually found himself selling pencil sharpeners. None of it had exactly set the world on fire. Then, in his 30s, he decided to have a go at writing. And his first story was about a man who went to Mars. That story was Under the Moons of Mars, published as a 6-part serial in All Story magazine in 1912. Burroughs used the name Norman Bean, apparently intending the rather wonderful joke Normal Bean, because he wasn't entirely convinced that writing about Martians was going to make him look sane. A typesetter changed normal to Norman, and that was that. It's difficult now to imagine how strange that story must have seemed in a pulp magazine in 1912. Science fiction, as we understand it, hadn't really settled into being a distinct genre. There were certainly stories about other worlds, strange inventions, and journeys through space, but Burroughs wasn't particularly interested in the sort of careful scientific speculation that would later become associated with science fiction. He wanted adventure. He wanted a hero. He wanted a princess. He wanted strange creatures, lost cities, sword fights, and enormous battles. And he wanted all of it on Mars. The remarkable thing is that Under the Moons of Mars wasn't some obscure experiment that disappeared after its first appearance. Readers liked it. Burroughs followed it with more stories and almost immediately began writing the other work that would make his name, including Tarzan of the Apes, which appeared later in the same year. Tarzan would eventually become the bigger phenomenon, but John Carter has arrived first. And I think it's important when we look at Barsoom, Burroughs wasn't sitting down in 1912 thinking, I'm going to invent the foundations of science fantasy. He was just trying to write a bloody good adventure story. The extraordinary thing is that, while doing it, he happened to create one of the most enduring imaginary worlds in popular literature. And to get there, he needed a hero. A very unusual one. John Carter is a rather odd hero when you stop and think about him. He isn't a scientist, a millionaire, a detective, or a brilliant inventor. He doesn't build a spaceship and decide to go exploring Mars. He simply finds himself there. Carter is a former Confederate cavalry officer living in Virginia after the American Civil War. Burroughs gives us very little explanation for what happens to him. Carter enters a mysterious cave and, in effect, wakes up on Mars. And this is where Burroughs makes one of his happiest discoveries. Mars has much less gravity than Earth. So when John Carter arrives, he discovers that he's suddenly very, very good at jumping and fighting and generally being a complete nuisance to anyone who gets in his way. It's a wonderfully simple way of giving an Earthman superhuman abilities without making him a superhero in the modern sense. Carter hasn't been bitten by anything, exposed to radiation, or given a magic suit. He's simply brought the physical advantages of an Earthman into a world where they're enormously exaggerated. Of course, being able to jump extraordinary distances doesn't help much when you're surrounded by 4 armed green Martians. And that's Carter's first real encounter with Barsoom. The Tharks are probably the first thing most readers remember from the books. Enormous green creatures 4 arms, tusks, and a society that makes our own ideas about family and personal relationships look positively cosy. Among them, Carter meets Tars Tarkas, who becomes his friend and ally. And then there's Deja Thoris, Princess of Helium. This is where the story settles into the form that Burroughs clearly enjoys most. Carter has a princess to rescue, enemies to fight, strange cities to escape from, and an entire alien civilization to understand while he's doing it. And it's worth remembering that Carter isn't really there to study Barsoom. He's there to have an adventure. That's one of the reasons the books move so quickly. Burroughs doesn't stop every few pages to explain his world in encyclopedic detail. Carter discovers it because something is usually trying to kill him. And that also gives us an interesting way into the character. Carter is an outsider, but he's not really a fish out of water comic character. He adapts remarkably quickly. Within a surprisingly short time, he's learning the languages, understanding the customs, making friends, falling in love, and becoming one of the most formidable warriors on the planet. That's very much the pulp adventure hero. But there's something else going on. Carter has arrived on a dying world, and the more he sees of Barsoom, the more we realise that this isn't simply a fantastic version of Mars. It's a world with a history. One of the things I find most interesting about Barsoom is that Burroughs didn't imagine Mars as a brand new world waiting to be explored. He imagined an old one. By the time John Carter arrives, Barsoom is already dying. Its oceans have largely disappeared. Its great canal system carries water across an increasingly dry planet. And enormous cities and civilizations have been built on the remains of much older ones. It's a lovely bit of world building because it gives the place a sense of history before Carter has even arrived. And it wasn't entirely invented out of thin air. Burroughs was writing at a time when Mars was a subject of enormous public fascination. The American astronomer Lowell had spent years studying the planet and arguing that the lines he believed he could see on its surface were artificial canals, possibly built by an intelligent civilization trying to transport water from the polar regions. We now know that those canals weren't really there. But in 1912, the idea of a Mars covered in mysterious channels was perfectly respectable popular science. Burroughs took that idea and ran with it. His canals aren't optical illusions, they're the infrastructure of an entire civilization. And that gives Barsoom one of its most distinctive features. This isn't a planet where John Carter discovers untouched wilderness. Everywhere he goes, there are signs that people have been here for a very long time. There are abandoned cities, ruins, old roads and waterways, civilizations that have risen and fallen. And then, wonderfully, there are the cities that are still alive. Helium, with its enormous twin cities, is not some primitive Martian settlement. It's a sophisticated civilization with its own politics, technology, armies, and social hierarchy. Even the apparent emptiness of Barsoom has a story behind it. The oceans disappeared because the planet was drying out. The atmosphere is maintained by a vast atmosphere plant. The remaining water and resources have become matters of survival. So the setting isn't just an excuse for Carter to have adventures. It gives the adventures some urgency. Everyone in Barsoom is living on a world whose resources are running out. And there's something rather melancholy about that, even though Burroughs isn't particularly interested in lingering over it. He's much too keen to get John Carter into the next fight. But occasionally, underneath all the sword fights and flying ships, you get this extraordinary picture of an ancient civilization trying to keep itself alive on a dying planet. And I reckon that is one of the reasons Barsoom has such a distinctive atmosphere. It's exotic, certainly. It's fantastical. But it's also decadent. You're not exploring the beginning of a world. You're wandering around at the end of one. And once you've got that into your head, the strange peoples who inhabit Barsoom start to make a lot more sense. And this is where Barsoom gets particularly interesting, because Burroughs didn't populate his Mars with one conventionally standardised race of Martians. He gave us several. The first, and probably the most memorable, are the Tharks. They're the green Martians, enormous, four-armed, tusked, and completely unlike the humans John Carter has known on Earth. They don't live in conventional families. They don't have the same sort of romantic relationships as the Red Martians, and their society is built around a rather brutal warrior culture. and yet Burroughs doesn't leave them as monsters. When Carter first meets the Tharks, they're obviously alien and often frightening, but through Tars Tarkas in particular, we gradually discover that there are people with their own loyalties, friendships, ambitions, and capacity for affection. Tars Tarkas is probably the character who makes that most obvious. He begins as an intimidating green warrior, but as Carter gets to know him, he becomes one of the most sympathetic characters in the whole series. Then there are the Red Martians, who are much closer to human beings in appearance and culture. They're the people who dominate the great cities and kingdoms of Barsoom, including Helium, and Dejar Thoris is a Red Martian. What's revealed by this contrast is that Green Martians are presented as primitive and warlike, while the Red Martians have cities, technology, government, and elaborate social structures. But Burroughs doesn't simply make one group good and the other group bad. Carter's experiences with the Darks complete that distinction. The supposedly savage people are capable of extraordinary loyalty, while the supposedly civilized peoples of Barsoom are perfectly capable of cruelty, treachery, and political scheming. As the series goes on, Burroughs expands the picture considerably further, introducing other peoples and civilizations, including black, white, and yellow Martians. I don't want to get too far ahead of the books here because part of the fun of Barsoom is discovering these things as Carter does. But it does tell us something about the way Burroughs was constructing his world. He wasn't imagining Martians as one species. He was imagining a whole planet whose peoples had evolved separately and developed their own cultures, appearances, and histories. And we do have to be a little careful with the language we use about Burroughs. It's very tempting, more than a century later, to look at the colours he gives these different peoples and immediately impose a modern interpretation on them. There are certainly racial ideas running through the books, and some of them are uncomfortable to a modern reader. Burroughs was a writer of his period, and his assumptions about race, civilization, and what constituted the savage people are part of that. And I'm wary of pretending that we can reduce the whole of Barsoom to a simple diagram of Burroughs' personal racial beliefs. The books are messier than that. What I find most interesting is the fact that John Carter's own ideas are repeatedly challenged by what he finds on Mars. He arrives expecting the unfamiliar to be strange and dangerous. Then he meets a Thark called Tars Tarkas, and gradually the alien becomes a friend. It's a pretty important part of the Barsoom formula. The world keeps telling John Carter that the people who look different from him aren't necessarily the people he needs to fear. The more time John Carter spends on Barsoom, the more you realise that Burroughs wasn't simply inventing a collection of exotic backdrops for his hero to run through. There's a whole civilization underneath the adventures. The great cities have their own governments and rivalries. Helium has its twin cities, its armies, and its enormous fleet of airships. Other cities and kingdoms have their own customs and ambitions, and very few of them seem to have any difficulty finding a reason to go to war with somebody else. And then there are the airships. I love the fact that Burroughs puts what is essentially a sword and sorcery adventure together with what in 1912 must have seemed like a fantastically advanced technology. You can have John Carter fighting somebody with a sword one minute and climbing aboard a flying machine the next. And somehow it doesn't seem strange. That's partly because Burroughs never spends too much time worrying about whether all of it makes scientific sense. The machines exist because they make the adventure more interesting. The same is true of the weapons. There are rifles and pistols, but there's still an enormous amount of sword fighting. Carter is a warrior in a world where technology hasn't made the old-fashioned heroic duel obsolete. In fact, if anything, it makes it more fun. Then there's the atmosphere plant. This is one of those ideas that gives Barsoom a sense of scale beyond whatever adventure Carter happens to be involved in at the moment. The entire planet depends upon a vast machine maintaining its atmosphere, and when that system is threatened, the consequences aren't just personal. The whole world is at risk. That's a surprisingly good piece of storytelling because Burroughs has created a problem that is simultaneously enormous and very simple. John Carter may be one of the strongest men on Mars. He may be an exceptional swordsman. He may be able to leap over buildings, but none of that is much use if the air runs out. And it's why Barsoom feels so much more substantial than a succession of invented names and exotic scenery. It has systems, it has resources, it has technology, politics, and history. Most importantly, it has people who have to live with the consequences of all those things. Of course, Burroughs isn't writing a painstaking simulation of an alien civilization. He'll happily invent something that sounds wonderful and then move on to the next wonderful thing. And that's part of the charm. Barsoom isn't meant to withstand a scientific audit. It's meant to feel as though just beyond the next hill there's another city, another civilization, another creature, or another adventure waiting for John Carter, and there usually is. That's the real achievement of this world. And then, of course, there are the animals. Because if Burroughs had stopped at green Martians, red Martians, and flying ships, Barsoom would still have been a remarkable place. But apparently that wasn't nearly enough. There are the thoats, the great multi-legged beasts used as mounts by the Martians. There are calots, enormous dog-like creatures with 10 legs. There are the zitidars, great beasts used for hauling and transport. And then there are the banths. The banth is sometimes described as a Martian lion, although that doesn't really prepare you for it. It's enormous, it has multiple legs, and it has several mouths. Yes, several mouths. And this is one of the things I love about Burroughs. He doesn't seem particularly interested in making his creatures plausible. He wants them to be memorable, and they are. Even the Tharks themselves occupy that slightly blurred territory between people and monsters. 4 arms, green skin, tusks, and towering over John Carter. They look like something that ought to be waiting for him at the end of a dungeon. Instead, one of them becomes his best friend. That tells us something about the way Burroughs uses the creatures of Barsoom. They are not simply there to make the place look alien, they are part of the adventure. John Carter has to learn which creatures can be ridden, which ones might eat him, which ones can be befriended, and which ones are best avoided altogether. It's very much the imagination of a boy who has been allowed to fill an entire planet with monsters. I think that's one reason the books have translated so naturally into comics and film. You can draw a banth once, and you've got a banth. You can draw a thark once, and you've got a thark. Burroughs gives his creation such strong silhouettes that they've survived for generations of artists who have never needed to agree on exactly what they look like. That's a pretty impressive achievement for a writer whose original medium was words on cheap pulp paper. All this extraordinary world building isn't there to make Burroughs look clever. It's there because John Carter needs somewhere extraordinary to have his adventures. And the other half of the equation, for all the details Burroughs puts into Barsoom, he wasn't really writing a textbook about Mars. He was writing a ripping yarn. He was trying to entertain you. You can spend pages thinking about the canals, the different Martian peoples, the dying planet and the history of its cities, and then suddenly John Carter is in a fight, or he's been captured, or he's escaping from somewhere, or he's fallen in love, or somebody has kidnapped Deja Thoris. Again, the books move because Burroughs understands the basic mechanics of a good adventure story. Give your hero somewhere dangerous to go, put something in the way, get him into trouble, and then make the next piece of trouble worse than the last. It's pure pulp. And the way he combines that simple storytelling with such an elaborate setting is wonderful. John Carter might spend several pages explaining something about Barsoom, but you never get the feeling that Burroughs has stopped the adventure to deliver a lecture. The information is usually arriving because Carter needs to know it. He learns the customs of the Tharks because he's living among them. He learns about the political divisions between the Martian cities because people are trying to kill him. He learns how the airships work because sooner or later he's going to be on one. The world building is therefore embedded in the action. It's one of the reasons the book remains so readable. They're old-fashioned, certainly. The prose can sometimes be florid, the attitudes can make you wince, and John Carter has a tendency to solve quite a lot of problems by being extremely good with a sword. But there's a tremendous sense of movement. You open the book and you're off. That's something that can occasionally get lost when people talk about Burroughs purely as an influence on later science fiction and fantasy. It's easy to look at Barsoom and see the things that came afterwards. But Burroughs wasn't writing for people who were going to analyse his influence 100 years later. He was writing for somebody who'd bought a cheap magazine and wanted to know what happened next. And he was very good at making you want to find out. Which is why, despite all the strange science and the dated ideas and the sometimes improbable plot twists, Barsoom doesn't feel like homework, it feels like an adventure. And once you've got that, you can start to understand why the world escaped from the pages of Burroughs' books and began turning up everywhere else. One of the most obvious descendants is Flash Gordon. The Flash Gordon newspaper strip appeared in 1934, and there's an interesting bit of history here. King Features actually tried to obtain the rights to John Carter of Mars before turning to Alex Raymond to create something of its own. Raymond's Flash Gordon was also influenced by other sources, particularly When Worlds Collide, though it's not as simple as saying Flash Gordon is just John Carter with the serial numbers filed off. But when you look at what came out of it, the family resemblance is pretty obvious. A hero arrives on an exotic alien world. There are strange peoples and rival civilizations. There are princesses, tyrants, monsters, warriors, and fantastic machines. And every time you think you've got a handle on one part of the world, another extraordinary place seems to be waiting around the corner. That is very much the Barsoom approach to science fantasy. And then Flash Gordon made the leap from newspaper strip to the cinema. The 1936 serial with Buster Crabbe as Flash is particularly important because it turns this kind of pulp imagination into something you can actually see. Suddenly you've got costumes, sets, spaceships, monsters, and entire alien civilizations being thrown at you in glorious Saturday morning serial fashion. The serials became some of the most influential examples of screen pulp science fiction of their period. I should say, I don't claim that every strange creature or every flying machine in Flash Gordon came directly from Burroughs. But when I watch those old serials, I find it very difficult not to see Barsoom standing somewhere behind them. The particular combination of sword and planet adventure, exotic races, ancient civilizations, and fantastical technology feels remarkably familiar. Burroughs had helped establish the vocabulary. Flash Gordon gave that vocabulary a face, a costume, and a soundstage. And that version of science fantasy was about to become enormously important because the next generation grew up watching it. And one of those people was George Lucas. So then we get to Star Wars. George Lucas has never exactly hidden the fact that the old Flash Gordon serials were part of the inspiration. In fact, when he was developing what became Star Wars, the idea of making a Flash Gordon film was very much on his mind. When he couldn't get the rights, he started building his own space opera instead. So Flash Gordon is the obvious link. But here's where I'm going to put my own opinion into the mix. I've always thought that if you look behind Flash Gordon, there's another influence sitting there in plain sight. John Carter. I'm not saying that Star Wars is simply a version of A Princess of Mars. It clearly isn't. Lucas was drawing from an enormous range of things: the Flash Gordon serials, Kurosawa, mythology, westerns, war films, and plenty else. But look at the ingredients Burroughs had put together. A young man from Earth is dropped into an exotic world. There are different humanoid races, strange creatures, and competing civilizations. There are princesses, tyrants, warriors, and rebels. There are enormous cities, desert landscapes, flying machines, and technology sitting alongside what is essentially sword fighting. And the strange thing is that the resemblance doesn't stop at the general idea of space adventure. Even some of the details make you stop and look twice. Burroughs gives us the Tharks and their Banths. Lucas gives us a galaxy full of creatures and peoples who can be encountered almost anywhere. Burroughs has John Carter arriving on another world and discovering that the rules are different there. Lucas does something remarkably similar with Luke Skywalker. And then there's the particular combination of science fiction and fantasy. The spaceships work like spaceships, the weapons look futuristic, but the stories are basically fairy tales and heroic adventures. That's Barsoom. And that's Star Wars. Now, there are documented connections between Lucas and Burroughs, and researchers have pointed to specific similarities between the Barsoom books and Star Wars. I think it's important not to turn every similarity into a claim of direct borrowing. What I find more interesting is the bigger picture. Burroughs helped create a particular way of imagining a fantastic world. Take an ordinary human hero, drop him somewhere completely extraordinary, fill that world with different peoples and creatures, give him a princess and a sword, add some impossible technology, and then let the adventure rip. Flash Gordon carried that language onto the screen. George Lucas grew up loving that stuff. And when he couldn't make Flash Gordon, he made Star Wars. So when I watch Star Wars, I don't just see Flash Gordon. I see a little bit of Barsoom looking back at me too. And once you start looking for it, it's surprisingly difficult not to see it. By the 70s, John Carter was already an old character. Not old in the sense that he'd stopped being interesting, quite the opposite. Barsoom had spent decades turning up in different editions, illustrations, and adaptations, and the character had become part of the general vocabulary of science fiction. And then Marvel got him. In 1977, Marvel published John Carter, Warlord of Mars, written by Marv Wolfman and initially drawn by Gil Kane and Dave Cockrum. The series ran for 28 issues and 3 annuals. And there's something right about Carter arriving at Marvel in the 70s. This is the era when Marvel was full of characters who were discovering that there was a much bigger universe outside their immediate surroundings. The Marvel Universe had become extraordinarily good at making strange worlds feel like places you could actually visit. Barsoom was almost asking to be drawn, and Gil Kane was a terrific choice to draw it. Kane's figures have that wonderful, slightly exaggerated physicality that suits Burroughs perfectly. His John Carter looks like somebody who could actually leap across a Martian landscape and then immediately get into a sword fight. The Tharks have the scale and strangeness they need, while the cities, creatures, and airships give the pages that enormous pulp adventure feeling. The first Marvel story was called The Air Pirates of Mars, and rather wonderfully, Marvel didn't decide that it needed to invent a completely new version of John Carter to make him interesting. It went back to Burroughs. The story was set within A Princess of Mars, effectively expanding a gap in the original novel rather than simply starting Carter's adventures again from scratch. And that seems absolutely right, because that's the thing about Barsoom. You don't really need to modernise it. You just need to open the door. There's John Carter. There's Deja Thoris. There's Tars Tarkas. There's helium. There's a bloody great airship coming over the horizon. Suddenly you're back on Mars. I've actually got a particular fondness for these old Marvel comics because they demonstrate something that I think gets forgotten when we talk about Burroughs' influence. Barsoom wasn't just influential, it was fun. And comics understood that immediately. So if you'd like to see what Marvel did when it got its hands on John Carter, I've also made a short looking specifically at the comic run. Because after more than 60 years of adventures, John Carter was still finding new trouble on Mars. And after 100 years of Barsoom appearing in books, comics, strips and serials, somebody finally decided to put the whole thing on a modern cinema screen. Disney's John Carter arrived in 2012, directed by Andrew Stanton, who had come from Pixar after making Finding Nemo and Wall-E. Taylor Kitsch played Carter, with Lynn Collins as Deja Thoris, and Willem Dafoe providing the voice and performance for Tars Tarkas. It was an enormous production and commercially a disaster, but I've always thought its reputation is rather harsher than the film deserves. It's certainly not perfect. The story is complicated. The framing device takes us a while to get us to Barsoom, and the film has the slightly unfortunate problem of looking as though it arrived after a whole generation of films that had already borrowed from Burroughs. Some of the things that were astonishingly original in 1912 inevitably look familiar by 2012. But that's hardly the film's fault. Once it gets to Barsoom, I think there's a lot to enjoy. The Tharks look terrific. The creatures are properly strange. The flying ships are exactly the sort of thing you'd hope to see, and there's a genuine attempt to capture the pulp adventure spirit of the books, rather than turning John Carter into a grim modern superhero. And I rather like the fact that Disney didn't make a miserable, self-conscious version of John Carter. It is, at heart, an old-fashioned adventure film. So if you've never seen it because you remember the enormous flop story surrounding it, I'd say give it a chance. Forget the box office. Forget whether Disney thought it was going to launch another franchise. Just go to Barsoom. Because for all its faults, it's probably the closest most of us are ever going to get to seeing the strange world Edgar Rice Burroughs invented more than a century ago. It's quite easy 100 years later to look at Barsoom and see everything that's dated about it. The science is hopeless. The Mars Burroughs imagined doesn't exist. Some of the attitudes towards race, gender and civilization can be uncomfortable, although much of it is quite progressive. John Carter himself belongs very firmly to the heroic tradition of the early 20th century, where the answer to a surprising number of problems is apparently to draw your sword and hit somebody with it. And yet I keep coming back to these books, because once you get past all that, there's something remarkably difficult to kill about Barsoom. It's imaginative. Not merely in the sense that there are lots of strange things in it. Plenty of writers can invent strange things. Burroughs has the ability to make you want to see what's over the next hill. You know that there will probably be another ruined city, another strange creature, another Martian civilization, another enormous adventure waiting for John Carter. And because the world is so much bigger than any single story, you get the feeling that it could carry on quite happily without you. That's one of the things I particularly like about reading old science fiction and fantasy. Sometimes you can almost see the joins. You can see the writer making something up as he goes along. But occasionally, somebody makes something up so enthusiastically that the joins don't matter anymore. Barsoom becomes a place in your imagination. It's why it's lasted so long. You can see pieces of it in comics. You can see echoes of it in Flash Gordon. You can see the wider tradition it helped establish running through Star Wars and countless other works of science fiction and fantasy. But those later things don't make Barsoom obsolete. If anything, they make you appreciate just how early Burroughs was doing it. He was taking the adventure stories of his own time, the contemporary fascination with Mars, the old-fashioned romance of lost civilizations, and the sheer excitement of pulp fiction, and throwing them all together. And somehow the result still works. Not because Burroughs predicted the future, he did not. He was wrong about Mars in almost every scientific respect. But he wasn't trying to predict Mars, he was inventing Barsoom. And Barsoom is still there. It isn't Mars. It never was. It's a world that Edgar Rice Burroughs imagined at a particular moment when people were looking up at Mars and wondering what might be there. He took the canals that astronomers thought they could see, the adventure stories he loved, the old fascination with lost civilizations, and a hero who seemed to have stepped out of a completely different kind of story, and somehow put all those things together. More than a century later, we know what Mars actually looks like. We've photographed it. We've driven vehicles across it. We found that there aren't great green warriors waiting for us in the Dead Sea bottoms. But that's not the point. Because Barsoom was never supposed to survive a scientific investigation. It was supposed to survive the imagination, and it has. You can find it in the old books, in the illustrations that gave generations of readers their own visions of John Carter and the Tharks, in comics, in Flash Gordon, in the things that came afterwards, and eventually on a cinema screen. Every artist gets to decide what Barsoom looks like. Every reader gets to build their own. And I suppose that's why I don't really mind that Burroughs got Mars so spectacularly wrong. If he'd got it right, we might have ended up with a much less interesting book. Instead, he gave us a dying planet with ancient cities, green warriors, princesses, monsters, flying ships, and a bloke from Virginia who could jump about like a lunatic because the gravity was different. And more than 100 years later, we're still going there. That's quite an achievement. Welcome to Barsoom. I hope you've enjoyed getting lost there as much as I have.